doing? All right. Um, Hello, everyone. It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, with me this morning, at this ungodly hour, at least for here in the States, I have independent journalist, awesome independent journalist, Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa Beeley, please say hi to my audience.
Hi to the audience. I'm so sorry to get you up at this time of the morning where you are. I guess it's around 3 a.m., right?
Yeah, it's 3 a.m., but believe it or not, it's fine. Like I say, I've done shows at 4 a.m. I've done shows at 2 a.m. I've done shows at 1 a.m. And oftentimes I would pop in and they'd be like, when do you sleep? Why are you doing a show at 2 in the morning? I try to, I don't sleep well. I'm an insomniac. So I do shows at all hours. Now, today I was sleeping. But nevertheless, I said I'm getting up at 3 in the morning because I want to do the show. So I appreciate you coming on.
And then I make you get up, right?
No, look, if you were willing to come on, I was willing to be here. I appreciate it. I really appreciate it. So you came across my my desk, this glorious, wooden temple of sorts, for being an independent journalist in Syria. I found that to be amazing. How did you start your journalism work? How did you get started in this?
That's a really good question. I'm not a career journalist like so many of us, independents who've decided there is just too much stuff going on that we need to find out more about. And I guess, as I've said before, my journey probably started with the death of my dad in 2001. My dad was Middle East advisor to Ernest Bevin just after the Second World War, and of course, just before the Nakba in Palestine.
Yeah.
He, as Middle East advisor, was always pro-Palestine, against the influence of settlers into Palestine, etc. And even after he retired, he was ambassador in Egypt twice, once during the Suez Crisis in the late 50s, and then again in 67 after the 3-Day War. And Nasser actually requested that it was my dad that came as the only British envoy that he would trust to deal with the situation then.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So I kind of grew up in that environment, although, typical rebellious kids, I kind of didn't show that much interest when I was younger. But when my dad died, I guess I'd sort of absorbed it by osmosis without really realizing it. And I started to go through all of his papers. I started to understand the man, and his principles, his integrity. And eventually that took me back to Egypt in 2012, and then on to Gaza. And actually, the first time I went into Gaza, I tried in August 2012, but we were stopped at the border because there'd been the killing of the 16 Egyptian soldiers during Ramadan. And so it was a high security. And then in November, I managed to get in via the tunnels.
Oh, wow.
And about sort of 2 days after that, because we were spun again. So I was like, okay, we're going to go in via the tunnels with permission of Hamas, obviously. And then about 2 days after we entered, the war broke out and Israel started bombing. So, of course, I had... I wouldn't have left anyway, but it would have been very difficult for me to leave because I'd entered via the tunnel, so I didn't have official kind of
like, what are you doing in this country, and how did you get into this country? Oh wow, that's hard.
So I stayed through the bombing, and then I came back in 2013, and I was intending to stay for some time and to work on some projects and some ideas that I had to help with the sort of PTSD really of the kids there.
Yeah.
By setting up various projects. Unfortunately, then health problems took me back to France for treatment. But I'd met a very dear colleague of mine, Eva Bartlett. I'd actually met her at the border in Rafah in
also
Egypt.
Badass.
Yeah. in 2012, and then we kind of kept bumping into each other, almost kind of like weirdly by coincidence, you know, in little falafel bars in Cairo or something. And so through her, I got involved in the Syria Solidarity movement, and then started, you know, it's that transition from activist to journalist. I don't think you ever leave behind the activism aspect, because, you know, I was watching your interview with Abby Martin, and I would say the same thing. I have a clear bias. I'm against imperialism.
Yeah.
I'm against the colonization by the supremacist states, of which, you know, my government is one.
Yeah.
And so that's my clear bias. I'm perfectly honest about it, and you know, kind of live with it. But I evidence that with fact and with as much information as I can.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Bias, it depends on what the bias is. Yeah. I mean, I have a bias towards humanistic concerns. I don't shy away from that. I am proud of that bias. Like, why would I say, you know, it's like one party is being occupying force, and the other party, you know, one party has nuclear weapons and tanks. The other party has rocks and rockets every so often, like these bottle rockets. And why am I going to give as much time to the people who are occupying as I am to the people who are being occupied? That's not, you know, that's insane.
There's also this weird, I mean, when I attended this summer school in Uppsala in Sweden, one of the presentations was about what I call this objective oblivion, you know, into which journalists are now being funneled into this need to adhere to this, as Chris Hedges calls it, this creed of objectivity, which is killing journalism. It's killing it.
But there's no such thing. I mean, in fact, trying to enforce objectivity in some way creates this kind of warped perspective of events. I mean, like when I give you a perfect example, when you can watch like Chuck Todd or something to that effect, and Chuck Todd would ask questions in this way where it completely pretends as if the last 10 years didn't exist. You know what I mean? Like it assumes the US didn't destroy Libya, that it didn't destroy Iraq, that it wasn't bombing in like 7 or 8 different countries. And he would ask these questions of Sanders or other people with no knowledge of history at all.
No context.
Yeah, no, it drops context. Well, one of the journalists asked Jill Stein. Jill Stein was making this point: we have destroyed countries, we've undermined governments, we've engaged in military in affairs where we've like interrupted other people's governmental processes. How on earth are we making any argument about Russia? You know what I mean? And he said, I'd never forget it. He said, look, it's okay for Russia to make that perspective, but shouldn't you take an American perspective? And it's like, is that what you guys do? Like, to drop the context of a situation in order to get a biased perspective? It's like, come on. It's like, be honest. So, there's no such thing as objectivity in this case.
Well, and also, I mean, what objectivity basically means is that you buy into the establishment view. Yeah. You know, whatever view you have, whatever compassion is triggered by going to some of these places. Not that many journalists these days do go to these places. That's the whole problem. You know, we've lost those original war correspondents, journalists like John Pilger, who went to these places. There's so few of those left. I mean, I have a very good friend, Andrei Vlecek, who's one of my kind of idols, because he's crazy. He just goes from place to place. He puts himself into the most amazingly dangerous situations, you know. But the guy, that's what true journalism is, because in my opinion, and this is what I'm saying now to these kind of armchair, I don't know, stenographers.
That's what they are. I said this to all of stenographers too. I said,
you know, what are they doing? I said to them, you actually, after 7 years, don't have the right to an opinion on what is happening in Syria unless you've been to Syria. That's really how I feel now, because the Western corporate media, the establishment media, all it's done is basically crop the image of what's happening in Syria down to about maximum 20%.
Yeah.
I think around 10%. of what Syria actually is and what its people are saying and what its people want, right? And, you know, one of the things that's really been kind of hitting me full on at the moment is to what degree corporate journalism ignores international law.
Yeah.
It ignores the lawlessness of our governments in the West, in the US and in the EU and the UK completely.
I
And
always say
if
it doesn't
they were
exist.
to actually focus on that,
I say it
you know,
doesn't exist. I
yeah,
say
it doesn't
international
exist because
law.
it's run by the US, basically.
Yeah, it's
So,
blown away.
yeah.
I mean, I was me sitting here. I get shocked by the disparity between this is international law versus we don't care about international law, and yet we will use it to club other nations, but we ignore it, and the journalists ignore it when it's us.
Yeah. And that I just find extraordinary, because if they were to apply the tenets of international, you know, however kind of largely irrelevant they are to the nations who have control over it, as you said, in this world. But perhaps if the journalists were to actually present those tenets to the public would have a better understanding of to what degree our governments are criminally lawless. As you said, when they use international law under the R2P tenets or whatever to target, criminalize, demonize, and destroy sovereign nations, as they're attempting to do, but have failed to do in Syria. But of course, they did in Libya, they did in Iraq. And also, like you said, this contextualizing. The media is responsible for what I call kind of the gaslighting of the public. This is a complete abuser-victim relationship, not only by the state and the people, but by the media and the people, the NGOs, the think tanks. All of these state-aligned organizations are responsible for this complete gaslighting of the people, this introduction of fear triggers, insecurity triggers, you know, be they financial, be they terrorism, be they military threat. It doesn't matter. What they've done is eroded people's ability to rationally analyze a situation. You know, and again, this where the NGO complex comes in is producing this humanitarian cloud around the facts, where people are almost frightened to say, oh, I don't actually believe these images of these kids being rescued. And I'm talking about the white helmets now, or whatever situation, you know, the refugee crisis, etc. And we see these triggers being pulled all the time, and people are in such a kind of maelstrom of lack of information, but overload of kind of sensory and compassionate triggers and effects, but without that context. And without that context, because if they were reminded by the media of, like you said, of you know, the PR agencies that ran the propaganda to take us to war in Libya and Iraq, for example, you know, Bell Pottinger, Hill and Knowlton, the weapons of mass destruction, you know, if they were constantly given this context. I mean, I remember being interviewed on the one and only time on, is it NPR in the US?
Yeah, NPR.
Yeah. And the first question they asked me, because they knew that I'd met with President Assad in July 2016, was basically my opinion of President Assad. So I started to give a contextual answer. I started to kind of say, well, you know, the US coalition has a history of demonizing and Hitlerizing. No, we didn't ask you that. Pull the plug was literally
He's
pulled.
a vicious butcher, an animal. You met with an animal. That's what they're going to say.
But I mean, it was, and they actually pulled the plug. They actually said, "Oh, sorry, we lost connection."
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'm totally serious. It was the funniest kind of. I was like, okay, that lasted a long time.
It's like, you gave us a wrong answer. We didn't want that answer. We wanted a different answer. It's like we wanted you to say he was breathing fire, and that's amazing.
Yeah, you're not allowed to give context. It's
You didn't give us the right answer, miss. We wanted a different. You know, when Tulsi Gabbard was on CNN, they said they were angry that Tulsi Gabbard went to meet with Assad. She wanted to see Syria for herself as opposed to just taking the news perspective of it.
Yeah.
Jake Tapper says, he hits her in the knees and says, one of the congressmen, I hope you didn't meet with the butcher. He gasses babies. Please tell me you didn't meet with their killer, so you know, this type of stuff. And just hits her in the knees with it. And she tries to make this point. Well, I've been there. I've been there looking around and talking to the people. You haven't. And those people have said they don't want us sending terrorists to their country. Like that. And Jake Tapper reflexively responds that the government says they're not doing that. Like, and it's kind of weird. Yeah, it was a weird segment. I mean, in this odd way. This woman has just told you she has eyewitness testimony herself of what's taking place. Jake Tapper, who hasn't been there, is reflexively saying, well, the government said this. It's amazing. So yeah, I wanted firsthand information, and I saw the people who you were talking to when you were on the ground. So could you tell me and the audience, what was your experience when you were on the ground? You met people who lived under the occupation. What was their response to Assad, and what was their response to the intrusion from the standpoint of the United States?
Well,
and wait a minute, from that moment, even the white helmets, like you said, these NGOs is almost acts as this kind of military force that's not a military force, if that makes sense. This kind of exertion of military power, but through this lens of we're helping, we're awesome, we're just the helmets who are pulling babies, and we're running through the rubble with babies, and you know, this type of stuff.
We're off to winning.
Yeah, right, right. You know, these
kind of a giveaway there, right?
Paid for by the West. Yeah. So, what was your experience in all of this?
Well, I mean, you know, Syria is an extraordinary place. It's the cradle. I call it the cradle of resistance, as is Yemen, actually.
Wait, what do you mean by that? You talking about against like Western imperialism?
Yeah, against Western imperialism, because I've been to Iraq very recently, and although actually they're emerging from sort of 30 years really of American colonization, and it's very visible in Iraq, it's visible in the mentality of many of the people that I met, but it's also visible, you know, from the hideous green zone type colonies that the US has created inside Iraq, particularly in Baghdad, for example. When you go to Syria, it's completely different. When you enter Syria, you feel this wave of resistance from everybody you meet. Everybody is informed. You can speak to the taxi drivers, you speak to the people on the streets. And yeah, you know, people will say, yeah, but you haven't been to the opposition held areas. Well, no, thanks. I don't intend to go into areas that are occupied by groups like ISIS, splinter groups from Al-Qaeda, you know, whatever moniker you want to give them, and they're consistently being rebranded to try and distance them from the atrocities that they're committing against the Syrian people. But effectively, as the Syrian people will tell you, they are all terrorists. There are no real moderates. You know, if there were any moderates, they've taken amnesty and reconciliation. Because what a lot of people don't understand with the Russian and Syrian military campaigns, the first option is always negotiation and amnesty, always. I mean, even now the campaign is starting to liberate areas in the south around Dara from a number of extremist factions, including ISIS and Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda. But the first step is always to offer them the option of laying down their arms and leaving and heading out on the buses to Idlib, for example. So that's a very important point to make. You know, there's this imagery in the West of this brutal military campaign by
bloodthirsty
the Syrian
animal
Arab
who's
Army against,
murdering and
yeah,
slaughtering his own people because
yeah,
they
at
were just
will,
standing there. Yeah.
yeah. You know, maybe later on we should compare the U.S. coalition campaign against Raqqa to
In
the Russian and
Mosul. I
Syrian
mean,
campaigns. Yeah,
what
and
we did
Mosul,
in
but
Mosul in comparison to what they did to try to liberate. I mean, we ignore. I mean, I remember one point we were bombing and killing 100 and something people in one of the airstrikes, and at the same token, they were doing bombings in Syria. And we were like, said nothing about the bombing in Mosul, everything about the bombing in Syria. He's a bloodthirsty animal killing his own people. We were just liberating this area and around. It's amazing at the way
I would highly recommend that people read a book that's just out by a guy called Tim Ripley, who's a military defense expert in the UK. He's written for Jane's Report. He's written for the Sunday Times. So he's a mainstream guy, but he's written an extraordinary analysis of the Russian military campaign from when they came in 2015 until now, until 2018. And that book, it's only like 216 pages, but I couldn't put it down because what it effectively did was to confirm everything that we'd been saying for a very long time, but from a military analysis perspective. So from a very in-depth, insightful view. So I thoroughly recommend reading that for a real understanding.
What's the name of it? You said the author is Tim Ripley?
Sorry, Operation Aleppo.
Okay.
And it's available now on Kindle and all the rest of it. But it's an absolute must-read resource on the Russian campaign and to what extent it was focused on the preservation of civilian life, the provision of humanitarian corridors and humanitarian centers for when the civilians were actually able to leave the occupied areas in, for example, East Aleppo and in Eastern Ghouta recently. And the fact that the Russian campaign, contrary to the kind of the Western media hyperbole, was very targeted and very limited. Because what was explained was that actually the majority of the fighting was on the ground to liberate these areas. And the way that they were running these campaigns was with Russian surveillance drones were going ahead and telling the Syrian army exactly where the terrorists were embedded and where the civilians were. So in other words, it was a ground battle. And from my own experience, having gone into East Aleppo during the final campaigns and immediately afterwards, it was very clear to me that in the majority of cases, the damage to the buildings, for example, which media in the West had been describing for years as having been decimated by these kind of brutal bombing campaigns. The majority were damaged, you could clearly see, by artillery. So in other words, by ground battles, right? There were some areas that had obviously been heavily bombed, some of the more industrial areas, which had been the headquarters of groups like ISIS early on in the campaign, and then Nusra Front and a number of their splinter groups, for example. But it was certainly not the kind of black and white narrative that you were receiving in Western media. And you asked me what it was like to speak to the people as they emerged from effectively incarceration under these terrorist and extremist sectarian groups. I mean, this is very important to make this point. These groups are sectarian, whether you want to call them terrorists or extremists, militant, whatever you want to call them, without a doubt, they were sectarian. So anybody that did not comply with their ideology, not even their politics, with their ideology, right, were to be imprisoned, executed, crucified publicly. When I was in Aleppo, after the liberation, I spoke to a group of little kids, 10, 11 years old, standing in the ruins of one of the buildings in an area called Marge. And we were just chatting with them. And I said to them, they, you know, again, you get this narrative, we're so happy to be back at school. For 5 years, the kids were not educated by these extremist groups, except in the mosque. So they were basically being radicalized.
Yeah.
And we were talking to them, and these little kids, you know, one of them said to me, oh, yeah, like we tried to escape towards the end. We tried to get out, but they actually brought us back. And as a result, they crucified members of the group that we were with publicly, and then they buried them like underground.
But Chuck Todd said they're moderates.
But this is in front of kids, you know, and the kids are talking like this is just really normal. This happened all the time kind of thing. This is, you know, we spoke to other kids who told me that in the beginning, when the so-called Free Syrian Army came in and invaded, in fact, in Aleppo, it was more the Turkey-backed Tawhid Brigade who were the initial invading force, because, of course, Aleppo was really an objective of Turkey to take control of that. So the incoming militant forces actually stole, I think, over 3,000 factories, dismantled them and took them to Turkey. So this was, not only was this sort of military invasion, this was industrial theft on a huge scale by Turkey, which of course has been largely ignored again in the West. But speaking to these people as they emerged, and literally in December 2016, I was largely following behind the Syrian Arab Army as they liberated each district. So we were going into districts as the people were coming out for the first time. And of course, everyone said to me, yeah, but they're going to say that because, you know, they're in a liberated area, so they're going to say whatever the government wants them to say. Look,
that's amazing.
I'm not an
that's
idiot.
amazingly,
you know, to me,
opportunistic. It's like, well, I understand that they've been liberated, and they're saying that these guys are bloodthirsty terrorists, but they would say that because they've been liberated by Assad. Exactly. And it's like, is it possible that they were actually bloodthirsty terrorists, and that people are like, I've been shocked by this. Isn't journalism. I mean, honestly, like what has been taking place in Syria has been a narrative that's been propagated in the place of journalism. That's the way I've taken it. When John Mathers comes out saying, we don't know who dropped the chemical weapons, we don't even know if it took place. That's honest for once, saying we're still looking for evidence. But the problem is the United States had decided to bomb, and then later on say, well, I mean, we're still looking for the evidence. What do you mean you're still looking for the evidence? You bombed another country. Like that's a remarkable thing to say. But you were there. I mean, and let me ask you this, the white helmets. So white helmets have been getting a lot of positive publicity in the West. That's putting it mildly. They got awards and all this other stuff. Donald Trump said he would stop funding them, but that was short term. What has been taking place with the white helmets, and why are people so skeptical about their behavior or their role in this conflict?
Well, let's take a look at this organization right from the beginning. I mean, it describes itself as an NGO, which is a non-governmental organization. That's a lie, because they're directly funded by a number of the states who form the coalition that have made a public declaration of wanting regime change inside Syria. So they're funded primarily actually by the UK. They were set up by the UK by an ex-British military private security expert, James Mazurier, in Turkey and Jordan, not inside Syria. So they were trained and established. I mean, he claims that they came from grassroots origins inside Syria, and then they were brought to Turkey and trained up. Whatever. I mean, this is his little kind of script thing. You know, they were candlestick makers and bakers and all the rest of it. Whatever. Kind of wonderful image. But Le Mesurier himself in 2015 admitted that this is not an impartial group, that they consist of only Sunni Muslim, and I would say extremist Sunni Muslim members. So it's a sectarian group. We're back to, you know, the sectarian element in here. And they've demonstrated their sectarianism. I mean, they've been photographed demonstrating against the Shia Muslim villages of Kafra and Fur in Idlib that have been besieged by Nusra Front al-Sham since 2015, full siege. So no food whatsoever is getting in or is trickling in when the UN or the Red Cross can actually get supplies in. And they're shelled on an almost daily basis, sniped. And the White Helmets at one point, when the kind of Madaya narrative blew up in January 2016, were filmed demonstrating against Kafra and Fura and calling for their extermination.
Wow.
The White Helmets were involved also, and I was in Aleppo when this bombing happened in April 2017, when the evacuees from Kafra and Fura arrived in an area to the south of Aleppo in Rashdin. The White Helmets were there with Nusra Front and al-Sham working side by side, as they always do. When the suicide bomb hit the evacuees, the over 5,000 evacuees who'd arrived, the majority of them were kids, were massacred in that bomb. Over, I think it was around 100 were abducted by the White Helmets and by Nusra Front. Now, these accusations and allegations are coming from the survivors of Rashdin, not from me and not from Russia. You know, everybody tries to portray the accusations levied against the White Helmets as being Russian propaganda, and in that way they can kind of, you know, cleanse their conscience of it. But in fact, the majority of the accusations against the White Helmets come from the civilians, the Syrian civilians themselves. And on that particular day, these kids, some of them dying, some of them injured, some of them still alive, were thrown into the back of the truck and they were taken to Turkey. Now, as far as I know, there's at least 40 of those kids are still missing. We have no idea where they are. The parents have no idea where they are. The hideous trauma that these civilians went through, having survived, you know, a number of years of siege and starvation and being picked off one by one by the terrorist groups, and a number of other awful atrocities that were committed by these groups, then come to Rashdin to what they perceive as a step to safety. And then this happens. And I've interviewed victims of that attack, you know, months after the attack, and the trauma and the suffering that these people went through. And the White Helmets have basically called for their extermination. They've called for the burning and destruction of these villages and these people. And we know from a recording from one of the terrorist leaders that this entire event was planned in advance. And yet, you know, yet again, we see the White Helmets in situ. We see them not really helping the civilians. They're piling the kids up in the back of the Nusra Front trucks before they're taken away. And you know, they're embedded with the terrorist groups and predominantly with Nusra Front. The leaders of the White Helmets, and I've proven this from going to East Aleppo, going through the White Helmet centers once they were abandoned, going through the documents and the evidence that they left behind there. The leaders of the White Helmets are members of some of the most brutal militant groups inside Syria, including Nusra Front, including al-Sham, including Abu Amara, which were the protection group for Nusra Front. So effectively even more brutal, if you look at it on a mafia level, even more brutal than Nusra Front themselves. All of the White Helmet centers were next door to Al-Qaeda centers or shared facilities with Al-Qaeda. Witness testimony again, I spoke to people in Bab el-Nereb, an area in East Aleppo, who told me that the White Helmets helped Nusra Front to bring victims for torture, for execution, for imprisonment in the center there. There's endless footage of the White Helmets mingling with, working with Nusra Front, participating in brutality, and of course, mopping up after extrajudicial executions of civilians, but also the torture, humiliation of Syrian Arab Army prisoners of war, while of course they claim that they save all of mankind inside Syria. in reality, members of the White Helmets have been filmed and photographed again, climbing over the dismembered bodies of Syrian Arab Army soldiers, celebrating the parading of a severed head. This was in close to Dara in 2017, June. And yet, you know, we're told, oh yeah, well, we sacked this operative. You know, but my perspective is, listen, if the Red Cross or the Syrian Arab Red Crescent carried out one atrocity that the White Helmets have been witnessed carrying out inside Syria, there would be outcry, there would be public outcry, there would be an international investigation. Why is this not happening with the White Helmets? You know, Raed Saleh, the leader of the White Helmets, was deported or refused entry in Dulles Airport in April 2016 because of his extremist connections.
Oh, but he's okay as a White Helmet, though. That he's perfectly sane in that case, but not sane enough to come into the country.
Yeah. You know, so, I mean, he was then allowed in by John Kerry in September 2016. So obviously, you know, the State Department overrode the Homeland Security decision.
That's amazing.
But, yeah. You know, so this group, in my opinion, is a terrorist auxiliary. It was created to give, I think, my opinion is prior to their creation in April 2013, the media was starting to struggle. It was starting to be exposed as producing propaganda, as producing fake narratives to criminalize the Syrian government and the Syrian Arab Army. So the White Helmets and these kind of Western financed media activists and media channels for the opposition, so-called opposition, were produced, most of them produced in Gaziantep in Turkey, and then infiltrated into Syria to give a plausible deniability to the media while still producing the narratives that criminalize the Syrian government. Because we need to remember that almost immediately after the White Helmets were created, we had the alleged Ghouta attack, chemical attack by the Syrian government that had, you know, crossed Obama's red line.
Yeah.
But equally, their creation was immediately after the Khan al-Assal chemical attack that was carried out by the terrorist groups against the Syrian Arab Army and the civilians. So when we look at the timing, and this is where I'm saying that context is so important, and this is what the media is not giving to the public. They're giving them sound bites, but they're not connecting the dots. They're not saying, but let's look at this historically. You know, why would President Assad use chemical weapons that he didn't have because he'd agreed with OPCW to destroy them? Why would he use them the day that the UN inspectors arrive in Damascus to investigate the terrorist use of chemical weapons?
He's a bad guy. That's what we're told. He's just a horrible, bad guy. And he's such a bad guy that even if it's against his own political interests, even if his own geopolitical interests, he just has to kill people with chemical weapons. He's just angry and a bad guy. I mean, that's all it is.
Even though he was educated as an eye doctor in the UK.
Dude, but when you make that point, they're like, oh, you're just trying to hug Assad. You're being an apologist. It's like, are you telling me I'm being an apologist by asking whether or not what you say took place? That's nonsense. Of course you should ask those questions about whether or not there's legitimacy to it.
But also, I mean, what is extraordinary, Jamal, is the media are not asking the questions that might derail what effectively could lead us to World War III, right? Because we have, you know, we can't deny the fact we have Russia inside Syria. We have Iran in an advisory role inside Syria, right? So any military escalation risks conflict between Russia and the United States.
Yeah.
And yet the media is not even taking that into consideration. And people need to be very aware of this. The media is pushing us all the time to the precipice of World War III.
Well, it's because they look at it from, again, an American perspective. Like, it's not, when Russia comes out and says, we will attack anybody that attacks the Syrian government to try to take the Syrian government out.
Mm.
That's big news. That's a big deal. I mean,
Mm.
you've had a nuclear power nation saying, if you attack, we will respond. Now,
Mm.
between the two, Russia has been invited, Iran has been invited. We have not.
Mm.
And in an odd, weird way, we've been protecting terrorists in a part of Syria. Um, could you talk about that? Because that's such an odd quirk. There's Bashar al-Assad has liberated like 90 something percent of Syria, and the terrorists apparently have fled to a certain part that is being controlled by the United States. And Israel has even been protecting some of the terrorists, making this argument that, well, the terrorists aren't the problem, Bashar al-Assad is the problem. This is an amazing narrative.
Mm.
And this goes beyond, like you say, what the people of Syria want. Like this is purely this kind of Western back push. I guess what I'm asking is, can you talk about how Western interests is trying to protect those terrorists that are in that part of the country through narrative by calling them moderates? That's the most hilarious part. But also from a military capacity where we've taken a part of the land and we're essentially protecting terrorists.
Mm. I mean, yeah, I think, if we go back to just after 9/11, if we then look at the invasion of Iraq, if we look at the communications between Blair and Bush, which were exposed in the Chilcot report,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
into the lawlessness of the Iraq War and the fake pretext upon which we went to war, the dodgy dossier, the weapons of mass destruction, etc., that we're still kind of looking for. I mean, you talk about chemical weapons, but when you read through those communiques, it's very clear that Syria was in the crosshairs. In fact, in 2006, in a Time article, Syria in Bush's crosshairs. In that, yeah. Basically, then they're talking about, and not forgetting that at this point, Condoleezza Rice was meeting in Tel Aviv and discussing the new Middle East, etc. Again, it's all about context, because in that article, it was made very clear that Bush was already fomenting the insurgency inside Syria. And I mean, the CIA has a history of intervention since Syria's independence from France in 1946.
Yeah.
There's been a series of CIA covert interventions in Syria, including the assassination of leading military figures in 1957, going forward to Hama in 1982. Everybody talks about the Hama massacre, which was actually, again, a much lower figure according to statistics on the ground inside Syria than is reported in Western media. And Western media doesn't talk about, the lead up to that crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood in Hama by Hafez al-Assad, which followed a campaign of suicide bombings and attacks on civilian structures, etc. So, and then talk about the DIA documents, etc., etc. I mean, there's a vast library of documentation of the planning of this so-called revolution in Syria. I mean, Roland Dumas, the French foreign minister, talks about in 2009, the British officials talking to him about the fact that they were financing and funding the rebels in Syria in order to overthrow the regime. There's a Professor Jeffrey Sachs recently talking about Timber Sycamore, the operation, the CIA operation, saying, this is clearly a CIA operation project inside Syria. So, I mean, the archived evidence of this being a regime change war is extraordinary, and yet somehow the media, even after 7 years, is still completely blanking that out.
What it always asks, are they incompetent or are they lying?
No, they're lying. They're lying at this stage, because there is absolutely no way that all of this documentation, all of this evidence of it being a regime change war can just be not seen. It's impossible, because it's willful ignorance. If you don't want to say that they're lying, it's willful ignorance, and it's complete compliance with the state narrative on this, and they're clinging to it despite it hemorrhaging left, right, and center. Because the problem is, for them, it's not gone according to plan. What they've completely underestimated is, even if President Assad were to disappear tomorrow, the Syrian people would keep fighting to defend their self-determination, to defend their secular state. The last thing that they want is to be governed by any sort of Islamist political entity, from moderate to extremist, however you want to look at it. Basically a puppet regime for the United States, and of course for Israel in the region. Israel has effectively used the militant factions to act as custodial guardians, of course, for the Golan territories, which they have illegally annexed, and from which, by the way, they take 30% of Israel's water supply. So, when we're talking about resources, we're not only talking about oil, because the US is occupying 30% of the northeast of Syria, which is the oil-rich region for Syria, using a combination of, let's say, reformed ISIS or reformed terrorist factions, and the SDF, which is 80% YPG, in a bid to basically create a separate state inside Syria, which again it's another familiar tactic. Let's divide a country into sectarian states so we maintain chaos, we maintain instability, even if we don't kind of totally occupy that country or totally colonize that country. We can maintain instability. We can prevent it being a strong independent state, which Syria was leading up to 2011. And also, if we go back 2002, Tony Blair recommended President Assad for an honorary knighthood. Assad was courted by the West. I mean, in the communiques between Blair and Bush, Blair actually said quite clearly, okay, we're taking out Iraq. Let's treat Iran and Syria a little bit differently. Let's give them a chance at a different relationship.
Wow.
Right? So hence the offering of a knighthood. But guess what? President Assad said no too many times. He said no to the US-backed Qatari-Turkey pipeline. He was working on the 5Cs project, which was to make Syria a hub for trade with China, with Russia. So it was kind of looking too far to the east for US unipolarity. That was like, no. If you look at, in 2009, David Lash, an American academic who had spent considerable time with President Assad, wrote a book called The New Lion of Damascus. I, again, recommend everyone reading it. And in that, you couldn't have a more kind of glowing report of a reformist president. But guess what? In 2012, David Lash wrote his second book on President Assad, which was a complete U-turn, right? So, when you take all of this into context, it's very clear that the West thought, we can get, he's UK educated, we can bring him on board, we can bring him into line, it'll be fine. We'll give him a chance at a different relationship, and he can just, come into line and stop supporting Palestine, stop being quite so independent, stop being such a socialist state, free education, free healthcare. Of course, there were issues within Syria, but even speaking to Peter Ford, who was the ex-UK ambassador in, I think, 2006 in Syria, he said quite clearly to me that Assad was a reformist. But of course, this was derailed by the Hariri incident, which the Syrian government was blamed for. It was derailed by a number of kind of other conflicts that, you know, were fomented by the United States in order to kind of maybe give a warning. Yeah.
Revolution of sorts.
Create an environment in which it was hard to bring about those reforms. So in other words, you know, create division between the people and the state, which is another very familiar tactic.
When we took down Iran with the BP thing, Iran's secular government at the time, wanting to share its oil with the people of Iran, what I thought, use the resources of that particular country for the people of that country. And we send in our goons in order to kind of foment a revolution. Same thing in Libya, send in goons to foment a revolution. And then say, we need to go in and protect people by killing a lot of people. This is a humanitarian thing to do. And we're just going in to protect. That's all. We're not changing the regime. We're just going in to protect. Oh, we had to change the regime. The country was batshit crazy and we had to do what we had to do. I'm always amazed that the media looks at this and says, this is purely what it is. The United States has nothing to do with this. It's just an uprising of people who were doctors and lawyers and cobblers who said, we're sick of the Syrian government and we're going to get these weapons and we're going to fight. That's not what took place, right? I mean, maybe it started that way, but at a certain point, Qatar, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United States, the UK, Israel, all took stake in this one country. It wasn't just an uprising, right? I mean, it was also interference by the West with regards to this uprising. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as I've said, Roland Dumas has stated that the British were involved in the uprising in 2009, fomenting it in 2006. Bush was talking about already backing the opposition groups, deciding which ones would be the most likely to effect regime change. Wow. Back in 2004, the BBC Media Action were inside Syria, and they've put out statements to this effect, saying that they were targeting those who would be against the regime. They were working with them, classic amazing, infiltration and fomenting of an insurgent. So again, as I say, it was very clear. Ali Hashem of Al Jazeera in 2012 resigned from Al Jazeera because they refused to broadcast his reports on militants coming in from Jordan and Lebanon and arms coming in.
That's amazing.
Qatar Red Crescent in 2012 was caught smuggling money in to buy arms, etc. So the early protests, of course, as I said, there was opposition to the Syrian government. There was a desire for reforms. But Assad put through a very detailed reform program. And I think another very good analyst, political analyst, Sharmin Nawani, wrote a brilliant article, I think last year, on the fact that have we gone through 6 years at that point of devastation, loss of life, bloodshed, in order to return to the 2011 reforms. So in other words, the West never wanted Assad to succeed with his reforms. They never wanted stability unless he was going to come into line with their resource plans, with the security of Israel in the region, drops the support for the Palestinian cause, et cetera, and also peel. Another point that came out in around 2006 was the fact that America desperately wanted Assad to divorce itself from Iran.
From Russia.
And from Iran at this point. They wanted, I think the wording was they wanted Syria to peel away from Iran. Now what they're working on, according to a leaked diplomatic cable earlier this year, February this year, from a British diplomat in Washington, actually, David Satterfield made the point that the priority for them now is to cut what they describe as the umbilical cord between Russia and Assad.
Yeah.
So, you
clear
know,
out those
hence
old
to me,
quote
in my
unquote
opinion,
Soviet regimes.
yeah, you know, because they don't like this, because of what Syria has done for Russia is to really propel it onto the global stage as an honest international broker, actually. You know, while the US is perceived as being fundamentally dishonest.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Nikki Haley, was it yesterday or the day before?
Yeah, pulled out
when they walk out of the
security.
UNHRC.
Yeah.
I
And what's
mean,
amazing about it, she comes out and says, you all are biased. Every other country is trying to saying killing, injuring 2,000 people, killing hundreds of people, including babies, gassing babies, is, you know, that's wrong. We don't like that. And we're going to stand up and say that. Nikki Haley was like, you all are biased. You all biased. Each and every one of you are biased. It's like, if it's everybody, Nikki, maybe it's not them. Maybe it's not them. Maybe it has more to do with you. You know, the sad part about this is, as I watched the story take place, it's debilitating to know that we were supporting terrorists. It is more debilitating. Yeah, right. It's more debilitating to realize that the media was covering for us supporting terrorists. It is painful when you realize that the trauma that has taken place over the last X number of years was pushed by our governments in an attempt at regime change. Rachel Maddow crying on camera for immigrants coming into the country. And I always think about stuff like, but this is a war in which hundreds of thousands of people have been slaughtered. And they weren't slaughtered just because. They were slaughtered for international political reasons, where one government wanted to change over another government and make it more in line with the West. That is painful. Let me ask you this. So, military strikes again. You said you were expecting another chemical weapon strike. Could you talk about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we consider the fact that the US, as I said, is occupying 30% of Syrian territory in the northeast, the Syrian Arab Army is now in the midst of a campaign which it started around 2 days ago in the south to liberate areas around Sueda and Dara, which bring it into almost direct confrontation with Israel on the border with the Israeli annexed territory in the Golan areas. And so what will happen, Eastern Ghouta was already a major blow to Israel. I mean, I think articles went out in Israeli press in March of this year saying Ghouta would be a huge loss because the terrorists had taken over the Damascus air defense systems in taking the Ghouta suburbs. And we'd seen previously, every time the Syrian Arab Army had made any efforts to liberate those areas, Israel would bomb. And it would bomb the Mezeh air base in the suburbs of Damascus that were used to keep the terrorist factions under control. Because, again, what people don't understand is that whether it's in East Aleppo or whether it's in East Ghouta, those areas occupied by those terrorists are on a daily basis firing mortars, explosive bullets, sending suicide bombers into civilian areas of the city, so into West Aleppo or into Damascus city center. In Damascus alone, 11,000 people killed, 1,500 of those children, 30,000 permanently disabled. And by permanently disabled, I mean the majority are amputees,
Jesus Christ.
14,800 mortars were fired from Eastern Ghouta into Damascus from the period of 2012 to 2018. When I walked around Eastern Ghouta and into the ammunition factories that belonged to the so-called moderate groups, which included Jaish al-Islam, Saudi finance. Britain, by the way, funded the PR for Jaish al-Islam through Incostrat. an organization that was set up by the British government in order to whitewash the image of the moderate opposition, including Jaish al-Islam. And Jaish al-Islam was named in the contract with Incostrat, by the way. And Jaish al-Islam, you know, not only did they have chemical weapon factories, they had huge munition factories. I mean, you know, industrial centers producing the rockets and missiles that were fired into civilian areas, not against the regime, not against the Syrian Arab Army.
Civilians,
you know, what kind
themselves.
of revolution is this? And what kind of revolutionary just wakes up one morning and says, oh, here's a Grad missile under my bed, I'll just go and, you know, get rid of the regime. No, but seriously, you know, this is, guys, you need to understand the weaponry that these people have. This is not some kind of grassroots revolution. If it were, how could it have gone on for 7 years?
7 years.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, and they have tanks. They have, and people say, oh, but they don't have an air force. Yeah, they do. They have the United States coalition, thank you very much. You know, that is effectively working on their behalf. When they bombed the Syrian Arab Army, who were defending Deir ez-Zor against ISIS, by the way, in September 2016, and killed over 72 Syrian Arab Army soldiers, it was a mistake. But they bombed for an hour. That's a pretty long mistake in military terms, right?
They killed Russians also. Mike Pompeo admitted to the fact that they killed Russians.
And so, you know, what is happening now is we're seeing the dying embers of the military campaign, if you like. There's only the south, and then there's Idlib. Now, the south is going to come into, as I said, conflict with Israel. But not only that, pretty recently, the 70 tribes, or the tribesmen are separate to the Syrian Arab Army, from Aleppo, from Hasakah, and Raqqa. So Hasakah and Raqqa are in the area that is occupied by the US via their proxies, but not only by their proxies. I think there's over 2,000 American special forces, British, French, etc. in that area, right? Now, these tribesmen have basically put out a statement that they're united behind the Syrian government and against the US occupation. This is quite a big deal because these guys are a pretty fierce fighting force. And the last thing that the US wants to do is to come up against them. The SDF will not fight them, by the way, in the same way it will not actually confront the Syrian Arab Army if it didn't have the power multiplying by the US. And so the occupation of Syria by the US is in quite a precarious state at the moment.
Well, Bashar al-Assad said he wants his land back. And that,
well, he wants his land back, but he wants it back initially by negotiation. He's negotiating with the SDF. He's not going straight, because a lot of people misreported that, particularly in the media. Oh, you know, he's being belligerent, bellicose language. No. What he said was he would negotiate with the SDF if there was no way to negotiate their withdrawal from Syrian territory and their acceptance of discussions under the Syrian constitution. Then, of course, it would go to a military campaign. So what's the only thing? It's the only tactic that the United States coalition has left is another chemical weapon attack. If they were to stage a chemical weapon attack in that northeastern area against American proxies or against American troops, that's a complete sort of game changer. Do you see what I mean? So now we're in a position where potentially we're saying it's an attack against the US.
I've been terrified against this. I've been comparing this to World War I. I mean, on multiple accounts. In World War I, we had all of these alliances, and with these alliances end up tumbling ass backwards into a conflict. Archduke Ferdinand gets shot. And after he gets shot, one country gets bellicose towards another country. Germany falls in line behind one. Russia falls in line behind another. And you end up with these countries with allegiances that end up getting locked into a larger conflict. We are in that country illegally. That's the truth of the matter.
Yeah.
And the media doesn't report that. We've stolen land. I mean, we, for all intents and purposes, of taking a swath of land and have protected terrorists in that swath of land. The media doesn't report it in that way. They report it as the United States is trying to be a bulwark against Iran and all this other stuff, as if this is purely geopolitical. They're stealing land. Like that's a mind-blowing thing. Then you add to that, if there's a situation, like you said, where there's either a chemical weapon strike on the soldiers themselves, that, like, they weren't able to prove the last chemical attack. They weren't even able to show that a chemical strike took place last time, let alone that the Syrian government did it. And you didn't need the evidence. Nobody cared about the evidence. The only thing they cared about was the social media accounts of what took place. That by itself is terrifying. Yeah. We don't even need to show it. We just need to give you the appearance of it. And what happens, like you say, if that hits, if that stage on American troops, oh man, can you imagine that? Like you are literally talking about, well, the Syrian government has attacked the U.S. government with chemical weapons. And look at our brave men and boys and girls out here trying to protect freedom of the Syrians get hit by chemical weapons. Like, you can imagine the processes that end up taking place with something like this. And the media is not going to look that far into it. The media is just going to go along whatever the line the United States goes, because that's all they've done up to this point. Bashar al-Assad is a bad guy, and that bad guy is now attacking American troops, and you can believe it because he's a bad guy. That's going to be the narrative. Like, reality doesn't need to apply, and nobody's going to ask the secondary question of, wait a minute, does this even make sense? I am terrified of that, because I think the moment that happens, other countries get involved. So you're going to get the UK, you're going to get France. Those countries are already trying to get involved in the conflict. You have the white helmets as this kind of force, because they keep saying post-Assad. Post-Assad.
Yeah.
Like, say, years ago, a post-Assad government. That is terrifying to me.
Well, I mean, actually, that brings me onto like the white helmets. The white helmet blueprint was like so much of these intervention hybrid war campaigns was in Kosovo, of course, in former Yugoslavia. And if you actually look, James Le Mesurier, the creator of the white helmets, was on the ground for the British government in Kosovo also. And he and of course there was a managed transition. I'm speculating here because I don't have any evidence that it was him that put this in place. But there was the transition from the KLA, the kind of Al-Qaeda in Kosovo, to the security forces, right? So we're seeing exactly the same prospect in Syria. I honestly do not think it's going to happen because, Russian intervention in 2015 turned the tide of the military campaign in favor of the Syrian government and the Syrian army. And a really important point here to make is the Syrian army is not some kind of disembodied, tyrannical organization. The Syrian army is the Syrian people. The majority of them now are conscript, right? There is not one family that I've spoken to inside Syria in a number of different governorates that doesn't have relatives or sons or fathers or brothers or sisters in the Syrian army defending their country. So, that's a very important point here to make. In Ghouta, many of the armed forces had family inside Eastern Ghouta that they hadn't seen for 5 or 6 years. The same in East Aleppo. The actual troops that were used in the ground campaign in East Aleppo were the Liwa al-Quds brigade, which were the Palestinian brigades, because many of their suburbs in East Aleppo had been taken over by the terrorist groups and members of their families had been executed. So for them, this was personal. It's not, it's not, this is another very important thing. I mean, imagine in the United States, if you had hostile forces occupying 3 corners of the United States, so the Northwest, the Northeast, and the South. So in Syria, you've got Israel in the South, you've got Turkey effectively in the Northwest in control of the terrorist groups inside Idlib. In the Northeast, you've got the US. Imagine if you had that in the US, and if then around New York or around Washington, you had 20% of the city occupied by hostile extremist groups who are firing mortars into that, killing your families, killing your children as they come out of school, killing your sister as she sits in a restaurant celebrating her wedding, whatever, you know. And these are true events. This is what has really happened to the people inside Syria. Try to imagine that, you know, because this is what the media doesn't do. It doesn't create empathy. What it actually does is dehumanize these people. You know, it turns them into collateral damage, inadvertent deaths in the campaign against ISIS, blah, 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 whatever, however they want to describe it. It takes away the humanity. It strips us of any kind of appreciation of the situation on the ground. And that's why I'm saying, and unless you've gone to Syria and you've gone to all of these areas and you've spoken to the civilians, there's very few journalists that have done this. I mean, Peter Oborn is one. He got completely raked over the coals because he
Pilger also.
Pilger's not been to Syria, but he's been very strong on the fact that this is another regime change war. But Peter Oborn has been to Syria. He's actually bothered to go. Robert Fisk went. I don't agree with all of Robert
that's what it is. Robert Fisk, not Pilger.
Fisk went to Duma like days after the chemical weapon attack. And then he
raked him over the coals
for actually saying, I don't think it happened. You know, like,
they raked him over the coals big time. That's a really good point. That empathy is one of those things that's lacking. These are human beings trying to fight for their country. And I try to make this a comparison of if during the Civil War, Russia backed the South and Russia said, the South is the free United States Army. You know, this is the free portion of the United States, and we are fighting for the free portion of the United States. And they literally take Florida. And while they're taking Florida, they take operations out and saying, if you try to take Florida back, we will attack you.
Yeah.
Hey, that would be utter nonsense. Like, nobody would think that. So 2 questions before, because I've kept you here for a very long time. I appreciate it. One of my subscribers wanted to ask, what has been the role of Jordan in this conflict? And the last question I would ask is there anything that you want the audience to know that either we haven't asked or you think that they may need to know to understand the situation in a contextual way that I haven't necessarily brought up in this conversation?
The role of Jordan, that's a really good question. I mean, Jordan is effectively a vassal state, largely of the UK, actually. Jordan was responsible for the supply of arms, or you know, the arms were coming in and the militants were coming in through Jordan. So it's not a neutral state in this. It's very much co-opted into the US coalition campaign. Obviously, it's been the recipient of, I don't know if it's the largest number of refugees, but there is, of course, the Zaatari camp inside Jordan. However, and we've just seen, you know, Angelina Jolie doing her usual clambering over in Mosul, and she'd been previously to the Zaatari camp.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not even going to comment on this. It's as far as I'm concerned, it's just part of the program. You know,
propaganda. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's just bomb somewhere, bomb it again, occupy it, and then bomb it again. You know, and then get Angelina Jolie in to kind of paint.
Do you think they're useful idiots, or do you think she knows? Like, I mean, we're literally taking territory, and my thing is that I try to tell people, I don't care what Syria was like, and let me contextually make that point. It's not for me to make a determination of what their government is. Like, it's not for the West to intrude upon some other country to say, this is what your government is going to be. That is immensely problematic, and we should have a role in that. That's what it boils down to. Our military, our forces, our money, our resources should not be going into regime change. That's what it boils. That's the way I nail it down. Whether Assad is a dictator or not is besides the point.
Look, in the UK, austerity measures are coming in. The National Health Service is being decimated. A number of emergency services are being decimated, and yet the British government can find 39 million to fund the White Helmets, which is a terrorist auxiliary, if not a terrorist group, inside Syria, let alone the something like 4 billion that the EU has raised for the Syrian people. Well, exactly which people, I have no idea what you're talking about here.
For the moderates.
Because, you know, the areas are dwindling where the terrorist occupation is. So exactly which areas of Syria are you talking about here? Are you talking about the 85% of, and this is maybe the point that I want to end on. Look, you know, the 7 million internally displaced, where did they go? They went to the government secure areas. 85% of inhabited Syria is back under government protection and security. The areas which have been liberated from these terrorist and extremist entities are being rebuilt. Services are being restored, water, electricity, etc. Over 1 million have returned already to Aleppo. As I said, when I was in Uppsala in Sweden speaking to an NGO in charge of the refugees coming from Syria, he told me the one thing that sets Syrian refugees apart from all other refugees that he's ever worked with is that they want to go home.
Yeah.
They support their government. They support their army. Many of them, you know, some don't. I'm not denying their existence. But he said to me, the majority of those who've come to Sweden, maybe 120,000, the majority of them support the government, support the Syrian army. They were driven out by terrorism and by the war. They want to go home. They are desperate to go home. So as soon as services are restored, as soon as those areas are rebuilt, you will start to see, as we're seeing already, Syrian refugees going home. This is a very important point to make, all right? The so-called, what media in the West and what organizations, NGOs and think tanks call free Syria, the areas under the terrorist occupation, will soon genuinely be free. And then to what extent is the media going to continue erecting this facade of criminalizing the Syrian government when we will see, I can guarantee you, civilians emerge from the south with exactly the same testimonies as we've seen in Eastern Ghouta and East Aleppo and Deir ez-Zor, in all regions that have been liberated. We will see the same in Idlib. I've already spoken to refugees from Idlib who told me that they had to flee. They fled on foot. Yeah. They covered like 20 miles, 30 miles on foot to get out of Idlib, to get away from the freedom that is being brought by the Western-backed opposition terrorists, right? So, you know, gradually this entire narrative is being eroded and it's being shown to be the hypocritical, hollow tropes that our governments, all of the aligned NGOs, including the UN, and media has been feeding us with for the last 7 years. And Syria, I genuinely believe what many Syrians say to me, there are only two choices, victory or victory, right? They're not going to give up. Yeah. They are not going to relinquish their country to a foreign intervention or to a foreign agenda. They're not going to do it. So people need to get behind them. This is my point. You know, whatever you think, it's not our business, as you say.
Yeah, it's not our business.
You know, it's Syrians will resolve this. As one Syrian opposition guy said to me, you know, of course we want reforms, of course we want changes, of course we want all of this, but we don't want to kill Syria in order to achieve it.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Man, I love that because that's what it boils down to. And one last question. What takes place if they did relinquish control? What does the Syrian government become if a government exists at all? Meaning, what are these people fighting for? What do they believe will happen if the United States gives them their quote unquote freedom in this process?
Which people? Which people are you talking about?
What do the Syrians like? So say, for example, Bashar al-Assad loses and Bashar al-Assad was taken out of his seat. What do they expect to take place to Syria to replace him? Like,
Well,
I guess what I'm asking
the
is
question. Yeah, but this is the question that I ask all the time of these so-called uh, opposition members who demand the removal of Assad. That is their only agenda, right? When you actually go behind that and say to them, well, okay, I understand that, but what then do you put in his place? Who is your candidate? What is your vision for Syria? What is your vision of the political future for Syria? What do you see in the place of President Assad or the government, the state as it is right now? I mean, yeah, there are issues with corruption. There are a number of issues, as I said, that need reform. But hang on a minute, let's just look at the United States. Let's look at the numbers of extrajudicial executions by American law enforcers of American Black population and American Latinos, etc. You know, let's look at America's torture record. Let's look at the UK's torture record. Let's look at how the UK is increasing our oppression of freedom of speech and dissent against government policies. Let's look at how dissidents are treated in UK jails. Let's stop throwing stones at other countries and let's start kind of focusing in on domestic issues.
Agreed.
And our own homelessness. And I don't see homeless people on the streets of Damascus. I don't see them.
I agree with you. We cast stones at other countries and as if we're virtuous. You know what I mean? It's not.
We don't have the moral authority. We do not have it. Look
After
at what
paying
we're doing
terrorists to take down a country, no, we don't.
And look what we're doing in Yemen. The US is involved in the torture detention centers in the south of Yemen. I'm just writing an article about that now.
Did you see that story that came out? Yeah. The guys were being raped systematically as, oh God, that is a horrible story.
This is an extension of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and all of the CIA black sites, right? It's just they're being run by the UAE and the Saudi coalition and Yemeni forces loyal to the Saudi coalition. That's it. But it's not. I mean, I saw one report that was basically trying to say that it's Al-Qaeda that are being taken into the detention centers. Hello, no.
They don't know that. Like, they don't know that at all. So some of these people were taken without trial, without any kind of conviction. One guy said he just wished they charged him with something. He just wants to stop. He just wants to die. Yeah. They're literally systematically raping guys, like saying we're looking for a cell phone in your ass, and he says, "What do you mean you're looking for a cell phone?" It's like, yeah, that story was debilitating. Like to read it, and the idea that we giving these people billions of dollars of our resources. This is kind of what I mean. I want Syrians to choose their own fate, their own future. Meaning, I want them to make that choice. I don't want the West to determine what's best for Syria. I hate that. And especially not at the barrel of a terrorist's sword or at the barrel of a gun. I want people to have self-determination. And I don't necessarily think you get that by having a bunch of terrorists take over a country. It's none of our business. I mean, that's what I think this boils down to.
What gives us the moral authority to assume, again, it's down to this exceptionalist attitude that we in the privileged West have a better vision for this country than they have for themselves. I remember a speech by an Egyptian politician, female politician, Gamila Ismail, in I think it was 2013, to John Kerry. And she said, you know, the democracy suit that you've made for us is too small.
Yeah.
And I just thought this was like such again, please check that speech out because it's one of the most, and of course it never made it into Western media. It was never published. But it was one of the most amazing speeches. And she basically said, who the hell are you to come here and tailor democracy for us when your vision of the democracy that we are looking for is too small.
Yes, not
we want something beyond this. We don't want your democracy. We want our own. We want to evolve our own form of governance. Yeah. And this is the thing, like what right do we have to decide on what kind of governance is right for which country?
Yeah, we don't have
Syria
that right.
was on the way to, and this is what again the US doesn't like, is Syria was effectively a socialist state. As I said, free healthcare, free education, and that is still there, by the way, despite all the sanctions, despite the war.
Yeah.
People are still given free healthcare. Yemen, the same thing. As Jamal Ben Omar, the UN peace envoy, said when the Saudis started bombing in March 2015 with the endorsement of President Obama, he said, why is this happening? The Yemenis had reached political resolution. There was no need for this bombing. The Yemenis were fine, right? So 3 years of decimation and genocide in Yemen is for nothing. And it is sanctioned by the UN. It is endorsed by the US and the UK, who are supplying the bombs. They're refueling the Saudi aviation, the Saudi coalition aviation. They're sat in the command and control center in Riyadh, designating civilian targets to be hit with US supplied cluster bombs. Although Textron claimed it had stopped manufacture in September 2016, I believe, but there's still a stockpile, which was given. Lockheed Martin has its only repair center in Saudi Arabia, external to the United States. So, the extent, I think my last message has to be, stop believing in these humanitarian pretexts.
Yeah.
The US government, the UK government, the coalition members of the US coalition of terror, I'm going to call it that, right? Do not have a humanitarian bone in their body.
Yeah.
Seriously. And we need to stop buying into this idea. I know it's difficult to pull away from that and to actually see the emperor with no clothes, actually see the monstrosities that are ruling over us, because these terrorist factions are only a reflection of those who've created them. Let's be clear on that. The Hillary Clinton talking about the creation of the Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all of these, they wouldn't exist without the financing, the arming, the endorsement of people in power in our countries. So I have to say, the way I look at it is they're a reflection of those who are ruling us. And we need to start seeing that. We need to really start understanding the psychopaths that are in charge of our foreign policy. And that's not too small a word for it. When you go to places like Syria and you speak to the people there and you understand the horrors that they've gone through, and they are horrors. I couldn't even, I don't want to assail the senses of your audience at this point, this early in the morning with those images. But these are not even, in my view, they're not even Islamists. They're so far from that. They're further into the Satanists and the cultists, what they do to dead bodies, what they do to prisoners, what they do to children, to women, to pregnant women, and this is what we need to start really understanding is our governments and these entities are just two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, they've been working in tandem. I mean, the weapons that they've been getting, the resources they've been getting, the protection they've been getting, like you said, their Air Force. I mean, this stuff is, it's gross. And the idea that we've played a role in it to any measure, it's problematic. It bothers me. It bothers me greatly, which is why I cover stories like this, and which is why I wanted you, who's been there, who's talked to the people on the ground, to come back and talk to us, to explain to us what's taking place, to give this kind of view of a more contextual view of Syria. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. I know I've kept you for a little while. Someone on Twitter was like, he's a talker. It was like, yeah. Like I said, I enjoy the people who I bring onto the show. And oftentimes, I bring them on because I find them interesting, and I hope my audience finds it interesting. And so when I talk to them, I actually enjoy talking to them.
It's been that's been great as well, Jamal. I mean, sometimes, I can't say it's a pleasure to talk about these things. It isn't. It's horrifying. And, writing about them, photographing them.
I mean, as bad as it is, it's one of those things of, if we're complicit in it to some degree, then at the very least we could talk about it.
Yeah.
And by complicit, I mean, we give our resources, our tax dollars go into this stuff. Many of us turn a blind eye to it. I mean, just think about this insanity. I asked this question of what controls the lens of media. Why do they look at one horror but not necessarily look at the other horror? So the horror and attention has focused on children being separated at the border. It is horrendous. It is absolutely horrendous that Donald Trump is putting these kids in these baby jails. This is an extension of the previous president. However, it's not that America fell off a cliff. Obama also had these baby jails. But nevertheless, it's Donald Trump. Everybody hates Trump. They look at this lens. And I asked the question from a meta narrative. This is horrible for the baby jails. But what makes it focus on it now? And why not focus on the stuff in like we're paying terrorists? I mean, that's like, it's mind blowing to me that we're doing that. And it seems like that would take such much more prominence in our media of when we had the Iran Contra affair, that was a big deal. Ronald Reagan was being graded over the coals in the media. Ronald Reagan had to come out, Gipper, and explain why he was sending weapons, but, selling weapons to people who we consider to be our enemies in order to give money to terrorists and right-wing governments, or to try to get these right-wing governments to take over left-wing governments. That was a big deal back then. And today, not so much. We do it. We can send them weapons. We fund them. The media ignores it, doesn't bring it up. And the only thing the media wants to talk about is either Bashar al-Assad from that lens, not from the lens of we are doing something about this. I find that to be problematic, and I don't necessarily fully understand what creates the outrage because it seems selective. So I definitely wanted you on the show because I wanted a different perspective, and not even a different perspective, just a more rounded perspective of Syria. Because the only thing you get from this country, he's a bad guy, he's a brute, he's an animal, he's a maniac, he's gassing his own people, he's gassing his own people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, but is that true? And why are you telling people something without the full narrative of what's taking place, meaning us paying terrorists to do that?
Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming on to the show. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for having me on, Jamal.
You're welcome anytime. In fact, if you have a story or something to that effect that you want to break, you're more than welcome to come on to the show. So you have an open invitation.
Thank you so much. Take care and get some sleep now.
I know, right? I know, it's like 3 a.m. Vanessa, she was like, she says, what about 9 a.m.? So if 9 a.m. is fine. She was like, wait a minute, that's going to be 3 a.m. Screw it. That's fine. I'll be there. So,
thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, guys, I'm going to end this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you guys can always support the patron. Wesley, I saw your donation through Super Chat. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, guys, you all have a good night. Well, what's left of it. Vanessa, thank you.